Hey there, and welcome to The Gathering. My name is Maddie. I am your online host, and I want to thank you for joining us in worship today. If you're new to our channel or you haven't done this yet, be sure to go subscribe and turn on notifications. You'll catch messages like this every Sunday. They're available all week long on demand, and on our channel, you'll find other content to support you in your faith journey. But when things drop, I want to make sure you don't miss it. So subscribe, turn on those notifications so that you know whenever new content hits here at The Gathering Online. Then you can head to the description of this video to find a link to our church if you'd like to learn more about The Gathering, a link to give if you're interested in doing that today, and a link to a Connect card. When you fill that card out, it lets us know that you're here so that we can reach out, say hello, and get you connected to community. Now, we are in our last sermon in our series, Beloved Community, where we have been taking a deep dive into racial justice in the church, what it looks like as members of this community to build beloved community, a community where all people feel free to be celebrated and seen as who they are, and where they feel comfortable and safe being a part of church with us. And part of that work of being good neighbors, of loving our neighbors, is to do some of this hard work, to have uncomfortable conversations. And so we've been doing that over this series. It's been really incredible. In the first week, we talked about the sin of racism. We talked about implicit bias. We had a guest preacher, Reverend Adrian, last week, who talked to us a little bit about, what a vision for beloved community looks like. And today we are wrapping up this series by welcoming in guest preacher, Reverend Dr. Dietra Wise Baker, who's going to have a conversation with us about where we go from here. What does it look like to take what we've learned over the course of this series and move into the future? And she's going to give us some insight into that. I'm really excited to learn from her. It's going to be an awesome message. I hope that you enjoy it. If you do, be sure to share it with a friend, post it on social media, invite folks to worship with you. It's a big conversation, and we should do it amongst others and amongst community. I'm grateful that you're here. I hope you enjoy this message. See you next week.
It is good to be with you and continue this conversation on pursuing racial justice. You've already been talking about that racism is a sin, right? Matt said that it's a theological statement. My colleague, Reverend Ann Mingo, calls it a theo-moral statement, meaning that not only does it have theology, but it means that there's an ethical response that the church must have if racism is a sin. Jim Wallace calls it America's original sin. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book, calls it infrastructure of social and economic injustices in the USA. We've come to the realization of MLK's statement. We've been thinking about him in this theme called Beloved Community. But when we think about Beloved Community, almost 50 years later, the church hour at 11 a.m. when we worship, it's still the most segregated hour in our country. It's still a relevant statement today. And if judgment comes first to the house of God, that means that we've fallen a little short, y'all, right? And that if we intend to be credible witnesses to the world about the power of Jesus' love and liberation work, then that work must take place first in the house of God. We got to get our house in order. Is that all right? So after we learn what racism is, and you all have been talking about a definition of racism, and they're going to put that out. I'll give you a little shorthand that we use as trainers in organizing, that prejudice plus structural power. Prejudice plus structural power equals racism. It's not that we are powerless, but there's a group of people who have been historically blocked from structural power, and there's a group of people that have over history been given access that you did not earn to structural power. Are y'all with me? And so we as a church, we as a community, we as a people of God have to be honest about those realities that racism racism has distorted the imago Dei. We call that the image of God. I think Matt talked to you about that too. That the image of God that says that we are all equal, the image of God that says that there's no person that is up here and another person that's down here, that we are all the same in God's sight. The distortion of the image of God that racism has caused is something that the church must address. And we commit, I've seen your statement online that you commit to be an anti-racist church. And that means that you're making a commitment to a lifelong process for us to disentangle ourselves from the sin of racism that has distorted the image of God on this inside of each one of us. And so this morning we come to this realization, church, that we are still separated by race in our churches, in our neighborhoods, in our school, right? All you got to do is look around, look at your life, right? There's an intention and design to keep us away from each other. And the sermon series has roughly brought you through Jamar Tisby's arc. It's a way that we talk about in our work of how do you begin to address racial justice? What's a path? What's a model? And the arc says that you must come into awareness. You must build relationships. And the relationships that you build have to actually challenge implicit bias. Right? If they're just relationship with your same circle and your same crew and your same people, those are not relationships that are going to challenge racism. The relationships that we have to build have to bring us out of isolation from the ways that caste has pushed us into certain neighborhoods and pushed us into certain schools and pushed us into certain churches. Are y'all with me? Right? So we have to build relationships that challenge implicit bias. And then the arc says that we have to make commitments. And commitment means that we have to act. And that is my assignment today, to talk to you about what it means to act as a people of God. This is not going to be an easy conversation, but I hope that you all will be with me as we have this conversation about being co-conspirators with Christ, our liberator. Will you join me for a moment in reflection of the topic, conspiring subversion? I want to talk about conspiring subversion. In my tradition, we stand at the reading of the word. I want to invite you to stand for this reading. I'm going to skip around of Exodus 1. I hope that for some it is a familiar story, but I want you to hear it in the context of our present day reality. Then a new Pharaoh arose in Egypt who had not known Joseph. Pharaoh said to the people, "Behold, the children of Israel are very numerous and more powerful than we are." So taskmasters were set over the children of Israel to wear them down with forced labor. They built the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and grew beyond measure. They made their lives difficult and forced them to make clay bricks and to do all kinds of work in the fields. They forced them to do every type of harsh work. The Pharaoh of Egypt said to the midwives of the Hebrews, one whose name was Shiphrah and the other whose name was Puah, "When you assist the Hebrew women who are in labor, look at the child while it's still on the birthing stool. If it is a boy, kill it. If it is a girl, you can let it live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do what the king of Egypt had ordered them to do. They let the babies live. Amen. May God add a blessing to the reading and hearing of God's holy word. You may be seated. Let me give you a couple of working definitions as we work through this text. The first one is conspire. It's to plan to act together secretly. I'm hoping that as we get to do in this place, that we may conspire. My ancestors used to worship in secret. They called it a burning bush experience. They would pray in pots, and they would meet in the woods, and they would conspire secretly against the works of the slave masters and holders, to plan secretly, to combine, to work together for a purpose or an effect. And in this case, we are working together to conspire around issues of racial justice. Let's talk about a harder word, maybe, subversion. which refers to the process by which the values and principles of a system that is in place are contradicted, are reversed in an attempt to sabotage the established social order and its structures of power, authority, tradition, hierarchy, and social norms. Lord have mercy. This is asking you that we are part of a history and a country, particularly at this time, whose social order is immoral and it's unjust. And so subversion says that we're calling a people of God to resist, to rebel, to be seditious, to sabotage. And my people would say to take back what the devil stole from us. For us to talk, you all, about conspiring subversion. Are you with me, church? I know subversion's hard, and so I want to take a few minutes just through the text to show you the conditions by when subversion is required and necessary. Listen to this text. The first condition is that there is an erasure of histories. Somebody said, the text is helping me. All I got to do is preach the text. It says that a Pharaoh arose at a time and he did not know Joseph. That means that the Pharaoh somehow did not get the history lesson. That Joseph was someone that saved the Egyptians during 7 years of famine and 7 years of prosperity. Do you remember the story? Joseph stored the grain so that not only Egypt could live, but all the people of the land were blessed through Joseph. When Joseph's father died, the Egyptian elders went with Joseph to bury his father. Somehow, Joseph's history and knowledge of who Joseph is has missed his Pharaoh. So either the Pharaoh knows and doesn't care, or the history somehow is not being taught. What am I trying to say? It's not just a know where I can call the name, I can call the row. It's a knowing that cares about the welfare of a people, that knows their history, that knows what was done, that knows what happened to the people, and cares not to repeat that. There's a time that arrives when a Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph. I hope that you all hear me this morning. Can I give a little bit of history? Can you give me a few minutes just to say a couple of things? In the Forgotten Creed, Christianity's original sin against bigotry, slave, and sexism, this is my New Testament professor at Eden, he talks about that Christianity, you all, it was originally used to determine whether people could become slaves or not. I know a lot of people don't know that. But Christianity was what was used to determine if you could be a slave or not. And then black people and other people in other places got smart and say, well, let's become Christians, so that they cannot enslave us. And so then what became used is skin color. And that is why we have the conversation that we have about anti-blackness, because skin color was then what was used to determine the race lines and if you could become a slave or not. Are y'all hearing me this morning? Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States of America and Columbus and the Indians and Human Progress, I want to read this statement to you. He says, Arwaks, the indigenous tribe, this is on Haiti, they faced armor, they faced muskets, swords, horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them, they burned them to death. Among the indigenous people, suicides began. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder and mutilation, half of the 250,000 indigenous people were dead. By 1650, it shows that none of the original indigenous or their descendants were left on the land. That's a little bit different than that nursery rhyme that you learned, right? That I learned in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. If we do not understand what happened to black people, if we do not understand what happened to indigenous people and what really happened, we are destined to repeat it. Did you all hear me? Forgetting our history sets us up to repeat our history. I'm talking about the conditions, you all, in which conspiring subversion becomes necessary. Can we talk about another condition? That the fear of scarcity creates scarcity. We've seen so many orders, executive orders, and so much So many different things that are overwhelming us and just making it hard to understand what to do or where to go. Does anybody have that feeling? But as you sung in the song, and as my ancestors would say, God can make a way out of no way. God can take nothing and make it into something. But this Pharaoh has so much fear about the people of Israel and the text in their power and their growth that he wants to control them, mostly because of their economic value. I hope somebody gets that later and weaves it in. Mostly because of their economic value, he wants to control them. And so they are not able, he doesn't want them to be able to move. That's why they're given control and access to reach people like Elon Musk, who can make decisions to deregulate the environmental protections because it makes a difference in the bottom line. I hope y'all hear me. The policies that lie and say immigrants should be feared when there's a long history that our communities are blessed and thrive with immigrant populations. We cannot, you see, when there's fear controlling, it creates more scarcity, you all. When you fear scarcity, it actually creates more scarcity. I want to move to condition number 3. The forces of death attempt to thwart the forces of life. I want to preach here for a second because I want you to understand who God is. You've already been singing it this morning. But the beautiful thing about this text is that no matter how they try to oppress the people, no matter how they try to stop the people, no matter how harsh the labor conditions are of the people, God continues to bless the people with life. If you want a reason to conspire, if you want hope to continue fighting, understand that the forces of death can never take God's spot. They can never thwart God's ability to bring life and liberation into the land. I hope you hear me this morning, church. I don't care what plans, I don't care what policies, I don't care what procedures, I don't care what laws are tried to be enacted. The text and the history of the Lord our God is clear. Death cannot win over life. Are the conditions of subversion clear enough? Can we talk about subversion for just a few minutes, church? And I'll be out your way. The conditions for conspiring subversion become necessary. So let's talk about the characteristics of conspiring subversion. One, we need creative disobedience. I come from a long tradition of those who would disobey unjust laws. I think you see it in the text as Shiphrah and Puah are given a edict from the Pharaoh, from the king, to kill the boys at the birth stool, but they make a decision that they are not going to obey an unjust law. I came this morning to you, the gathering, to ask you, are you ready to get in good trouble? Are you ready if the time calls for it? And in our country, it may be a time where there are some edicts that are issued that are lawful, but they are unjust because they don't protect the poor. They don't protect the marginalized. And will we stand up as a people of God for those who God calls us to protect? I got a good answer. It may be that we got to be a little creative. I like what Shiphrah and Puah do. Some people say they lie. I'll take that, They lie. Somebody might come into some churches looking for our siblings who are undocumented. I learned yesterday in a training that there's 2 different kinds of subpoenas. If there's a subpoena from a real judge, you have to listen to that one. But if it's a subpoena from ICE, you don't have to listen to that one. I'm talking about creative disobedience, right? Where we might have to remain silent, where we may not have to answer questions. I hope that you all are hearing me. It will involve risk. Are we ready to take a risk? Risk means that we may suffer. We may experience loss. We may experience some harm that comes to us. Everything in our lives and in our church may not exactly be the way that we want it to be. We're going to have to position ourselves, the gathering. We're going to have to position ourselves. We're not going to be able to do what we normally do, right? Normally the midwives could just go in there and they can have the baby's birth and come out. But no, they had to be creatively disobedient. They had to risk their position. They had to risk their privilege. Are you ready to risk your position? Because God wants to use where you are. God's not asking you to go do something. God wants to use you right at your job. God wants to use the privilege that you have right now. What resources do you have? What relationships do you have? What can you lift up? What can you take a risk with? That's what God is asking us to do when we're talking about conspiring subversion. Are you willing to put your body on the line? Are we ready to I'm trying to get you ready for what's coming. Are you ready to put your body on the line? And I wasn't going to say anything about Ferguson, but one of the things that we learned during Ferguson is that a lot of church folk wasn't ready to put their body on the line. In fact, when some of those pastors put their body on the line, some of the churches got rid of their pastors. I'm just telling you the truth of what happened. They had to take a risk. And we were all transformed by taking that risk. We will be transformed by taking that risk. Our faith will grow when we take that risk. We will become a new community when we take that risk. But we cannot stay where we are and keep doing what we've been doing. You want this room to change? You're going to have to take some risks. All right, church. Let me say this last thing, and I'm going to be out your way. The midwives, they do their work together. I want you to understand something that our culture pushes against. Conspiring is collective work. I need you to get this deep in your spirit as an organizer. Because the tendency is to tell you, make your individual choices, consult your individual conscience, and make some choices about what you're going to do for racial justice work. I'm not saying that there aren't individual things that you have to do. But what I'm saying, for us to save lives, we have to act together. For us to make a difference, we cannot do this alone. Black and white people have to come together. Indigenous and black people have to come together. Asian and Latinx people have to come together. No group of people can do this alone. We have to conspire together. Conspiring is collective work, not individual work. So my question to you is, who are your partners? Who are you collaborating with, right? Shipper and Pua, generally when you're a midwife, you go to the one woman and you watch her birth the baby. But clearly they had a practice where they went into birthing rooms together. I hope that you hear me this morning, church. God is asking, who are you going into the birthing rooms of liberation with? Who are you partnering with? Who is your collaborator? Who are you conspiring with? Because you cannot conspire subversively alone. It's not conspiring if you are doing it by yourself. I just want us to be clear. The gathering, I'm asking you to sit at the birthing stool, not one by one, but as a whole church, to midwife and resist the decrees of death on the birthing stool and to defy the Pharaoh of this world and usher in new life. Yes, my grandmothers and mothers are rigorous. We have been instruments of God's liberation power. They've tried to kill us, but we won't die. We're still here. But the question today is not for my people. The question is for the people that are sitting in these seats. God is asking you, people of God at the church called The Gathering, will you be a co-conspirator with Christ, our liberator, with the oppressed people in this community and our country, conspiring subversion? God bless you, and Ashe.